Hey guys, welcome to today's fundamentals video on cardiac output. So let's jump into it. What is cardiac output? Now, cardiac output is the amount of blood ejected out of the heart into the body over 1 minute. That's it. The amount of blood the heart kicks out to the body over 1 minute. And the formula we use to calculate cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So let's take a look at that. Heart rate. Pretty simple. It's just the number of beats per minute. That's all it is. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to use a heart rate of about 70 beats per minute, right? If you go back into the algorithm that you were in when you hyperlink to this and you look at the treatments for treating heart rates, generally they're pretty easy and they're pretty quick to deploy. And quick and easy is a good thing. We like quick and easy. So when treating heart rates themselves, generally they're quick and easy. Put that in the back of your head. We'll get to that later. So that's the heart rate. Now we get to stroke volume. On the average day, the average guy has a stroke volume of about 70 mLs. And the stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected by the ventricles with each contraction. 1 beat, that's the stroke volume. And in the average person, that's about 70 mLs of blood. So if we look at this formula and we take a heart rate of 70 and a stroke volume of 70 mLs, we're going to come up with a cardiac output of about 4,900 mLs, right? Makes sense. And if you look at some of the text, they say the average cardiac output is about 5 liters. That's where they got that number from, because they're using those numbers. Now, bear in mind, you have to remember that little disclaimer you see at the bottom of television ads at the bottom of your TV screen every night. For the purpose of this discussion, though, we're going to use those numbers. Now, before we dive into stroke volume specifically, let's back up and take a look at how blood actually moves through the heart. Because we were all taught that blood enters the right atrium, then the right atrium contracts and squeezes blood into the ventricles. Nah, not really. I would say that statement's about 20% true. And here's why. As blood is coming down from the superior vena cava, up from the inferior vena cava, and it's entering the right atrium, you have that tricuspid valve there. And the valves between the atrial and ventricular chambers are like one-way trap doors, right? And as long as the pressure is greater on the top, they're going to open and blood's going to flow through. In fact, the only time they close is during systole. When the ventricles are contracting, the pressure gets greater, they slam those valves closed, and blood will either go through the pulmonary artery or out through the aorta if it's coming from the left ventricle. Therefore, all the blood coming into the right atrium passes right through and starts filling up the ventricles. And that's exactly what happens. So I got blood coming from superior inferior vena cava. It enters the atrium, passes right through, starts filling up the ventricular chambers, right? So the ventricles are getting more and more full of blood, more and more full of blood. So are the atrial chamber. Then the atrial chamber contracts and it squeezes its volume of blood into the ventricle. We call that volume the atrial kick. And the atrial kick contributes about 20, maybe 25% of additional volume that's going into the ventricles that can be sent out to the body. That's all it does, man. It just tops off the tank. Sometimes the atrial chambers contribute nothing to the project, right? Say like in atrial fibrillation. You got this blood coming into the atrial chamber, but the atrial chamber is just quivering. The blood goes into the ventricles, fills up the ventricles, but the atrial chamber never contracts because it's fibrillating. So you lost maybe 25% of that blood that would have been ejected into the ventricles. You lost your atrial kick just from atrial fibrillation. Now, let's continue on with that blood entering the heart. So during diastole, we have this blood coming down, it's filling up the ventricular chamber. It's filling. Then the atrial chamber contracts, kicks its volume into the ventricular chamber. Right before systole, that amount of volume in the chamber, in the ventricular chamber, we call that the end-diastolic volume, right? And that end-diastolic volume is actually more than the stroke volume. In this scenario, it would be around 120 mLs, right? So when it's absolutely full, the amount of volume in the ventricular chamber is 120 mLs. Then systole occurs, the ventricles contract, and kicks out that stroke volume of 70 mLs, which leaves us 50 mL still left in the ventricular chamber. we call that volume the end-systolic volume. That's the amount of blood that was left in the ventricular chamber at the end of systole. So now we can see that stroke volume is actually end-diastolic volume minus the end-systolic volume is our stroke volume. And the percentage of that stroke volume compared to those two is called the ejection fraction, or the EF. That's what that means. That's the EF, the ejection fraction, the percentage of blood that actually came in. So out of that 120 mLs, we kicked out 70 cc's. On average, we like to see an ejection fraction above 60%. Great. An ejection fraction less than 50% is cause for alarm. We got to take a look at some stuff. Because that speaks to how well the heart is contracting. Is it a systolic problem? Are we not getting a good squeeze out of that ventricular chamber? Okay, so let's look at this end-diastolic volume and how it fits back into our equation of heart rate times stroke volume. Now, if we have an extremely bradycardic patient, very slow heart rate, well, that slow heart rate allows for adequate ventricular filling time. I'm going to get a good end-diastolic volume. So in a bradycardic patient, that probably won't impact my stroke volume directly. However, if I have an extremely tachycardic patient, what happens is blood is coming into the ventricle. I'm starting to get that ventricular chamber filled up, but before I can get an adequate end-diastolic volume, the heart contracts again and spits out less volume. The heart didn't have time to adequately fill. And that's why extremely tachycardic rates can directly impact your stroke volume. They just don't have enough time. They're not allowing enough time for those ventricles to fill. Now, take that and combine it with atrial fibrillation. Let's say you have a patient in AFib with a rapid ventricular response. Well, we've lost our atrial kick and we've reduced our end-diastolic filling time, so I've lost volume on both sides from both chambers, and that will directly reduce your cardiac output. Now, another factor when considering cardiac output is called the Frank-Starling law. And what this law says is, the greater the stretch of the myocardium, the greater the force of contraction, right? That's what the law says. And I'll demonstrate it by using this balloon. You see this balloon is flat, there's no volume in it, there's no stretch, so I'm not going to have any contraction. Now let's put a little volume into this balloon. Okay, it's stretched a little bit, which means I'm going to get a little more contraction, a little more strength of contraction out of it. We put a little more volume into it. Now I've added way more volume. I'm going to get a greater stretch. But wait a minute, this patient had AFib and it reduced the amount of volume in there. Take a little volume out. And they're also tachycardic, so have reduced filling time. Take more volume out. So now you can see the impact of Frank-Starling's law on a patient that has AFib with RVR. You've lost more volume coming in, you've had less stretch of the myocardium, therefore you'll have less force of contraction, less cardiac output. Oversimplified, but that's Frank-Starling's law in a nutshell. Okay, so to review, our formula, heart rate times stroke volume. Say we got 70 beats per minute and a stroke volume of 70 mLs. If they become bradycardic and I drop that heart rate to 35, I'm going to cut my cardiac output or my stroke volume in half. Right? Go back to the 70-70. Let's say that the patient is extremely tachycardic. That is directly going to reduce my stroke volume, which will reduce my cardiac output. So what's the takeaway from this segment? Always treat the rate first. Why? One, because it's quick and easy. Go back and look at the algorithm you hyperlink to get to this video, and you'll see that most of the treatments to treat rates is pretty easy. You give a drug, you pace some, you cardiovert them. It's quick and easy, which is a good thing. If I'm 40,000 feet in the aircraft and my patient starts out, I want a treatment that's quick and easy. I don't want time consuming and difficult. Quick and easy is good, so always treat the rate first, especially in bradycardia. Stroke volume might be fine. It's only the rate that's impacting it. In tachycardia, the rate is directly reducing the stroke volume, which is reducing their cardiac output. Now, in addition, there's a worksheet we posted online on cardiac output. So go through that worksheet and it will help reinforce all the information we just covered in this video. I'm Mark, thanks for watching. See you in the next video.